Ltte. He says, thank God we have got the Maxim gun and they have not. That is the primitive stage of national liberation wars in the 19th century. You come into the 20th century and then you see the emanation of the most ruthless and determined first national liberation struggle, which did not happen in the non-white colonies, it happened in Ireland. One of the most understudied insurgency campaigns. I mean, it's been studied immensely in Britain, of course, but nobody talks about the Irish War of Independence as being the paradigm which a lot of other countries followed. If you look at the kind of campaign that Michael Collins waged between 1919 and 1921, people who came after him, like Menachem Begin, Yasser Arafat, the FLN of Algeria, even the communist revolutionaries said, we take a leaf out of what Michael Collins did to the British, which is not to face them in a conventional battle. Of course, he couldn't win. The Irish Republican Army was not really an army per se, but he essentially dismantled the infrastructure and mechanism of British control over Ireland. Separatist insurgencies or ethnic insurgencies seek to withdraw from the nation state of which they are formally a part. They may or may not include radical social transformation within the territory they capture. The most successful one to date that I can think of was the Eritrean separation from the state of Ethiopia. And that took a lot of energy, organization, and skill for them to succeed. From 1961, they finally succeeded, I think, in 1991. Now let me move on to what are the armed methods of insurgent organizations. Terrorism is one of them. There has been a debate among practitioners and theoreticians of insurgency, beginning with Mao and going through to Che Guevara, on the efficacy of terrorism. Is it something we as a liberation movement, a national struggle, should use, or should we not use it? Che Guevara came down hard against what he called mindless terrorism. The FLN in Algeria said terrorism has its purposes, and one of its most skilled exponents, Ramdan Abane, who was executed by the FLN because he essentially went off the reservation, he said once, and this is quite significant in my mind, he said, what is more important, to kill 10 French paratroopers in the rural mountain areas of Algeria, or to blow up a European cafe in Algiers? He believed that blowing up a cafe in Algiers and killing the settler population was more significant than killing French paratroopers. Now, when I say terrorism is an instrument of insurgent organizations, do not confuse terrorists with insurgents. I'm making a very controversial but actually very refined separation here. Terrorist groups are usually small and functionally weak. They don't have what we call functional specialization. Again, let's compare the LTTE to the Baader-Meinhof. The Baader-Meinhof had no capacity to do what the LTTE was able to develop over 30 years. The LTTE, Hezbollah, the FARC, and Sendero Luminoso in Peru are what I call functionally specialized non-state actors. They're able to wage terrorism, guerrilla warfare, and some form of mobile, conventional warfare against their opponents. And they can go up and down the spectrum. It is not a one-shot deal where they just develop from just a small organization through a medium-sized to a conventional. No, they have this whole panoply of weaponry or instruments in their arsenal. They are functionally specialized. Baader-Meinhof was not. Abu Nidal was not. They are limited by their incapacity. Guerrilla tactics are also an example of the weapons within the 20th century, 21st century organization, just like the 20th century. Now, I use the term guerrilla tactics because I really go into, I'm interested in definitional rigor. People talk about guerrilla warfare. When you talk about guerrilla warfare, or say guerrilla warfare, you're actually saying small war warfare. Because guerrilla in Spanish means small war. Another term for insurgency is small war. And I actually prefer the term small war over insurgency or irregular war or low-intensity conflict, because low-intensity conflict, for those of you who have experienced it firsthand, is anything but low intensity. So, but what are the tactics of small war? They are, and again, let me quote briefly Mao from his book on protracted war. What is basic guerrilla strategy? Guerrilla strategy must be based primarily on alertness, mobility, and attack. We must constantly be on the attack, he said. It must be adjusted to the enemy situation, the terrain, the existing lines of communication, the relative strengths, the weather, and the situation of the people. In guerrilla warfare, select the tactic of seeming to come from the east and attacking from the west. Avoid the solid. And Mao, by the way, was not the first person to mention this. If you go through the pages, I think chapter 6, book 6, chapter 11 of Karl von Clausewitz's On War, he has 5 pages on People's War, where he says, avoid the solid. That's what a guerrilla must do. He must nibble at the edges of the powerful conventional adversary and whittle him down, wear him down by a process of long attrition. And we generally actually conclude, when we read Karl von Clausewitz, a lot of people have concluded that he's not relevant to the 21st century anymore because he talks about interstate conflict. And also because most people say, well, he just wrote 5 pages on People's War or the Nation in Arms. The fact of the matter is, Karl von Clausewitz wrote about 600 pages on irregular war that has not been translated as of yet into any other language other than French. When guerrilla, now let me go back to Mao. When guerrillas engage a stronger enemy, they withdraw when he advances, harass him when he stops, strike him when he is weary, pursue him when he withdraws. In guerrilla strategy, the enemy's rear, flanks, and other vulnerable spots are his vital points. And there he must be harassed, attacked, dispersed, exhausted, and annihilated. And if you go back also to 1919 to 21, that's what the IRA flying columns tried to do to the British. However, I've said the Ltte was a terrorist organization. It was an insurgent organization. It's also what we call a hybrid organization because it was developing and had actually developed a quite effective and lethal quasi-conventional capacity, or mobile capacity for mobile warfare, as Mao would define it. Let me just summarize about the Ltte. By the late 1990s, the Ltte had transformed itself into a quite disciplined and highly effective conventional fighting force, capable of operating along a continuum that encompassed at one extreme suicide bomb attacks and conventional war in the north. Now, a non-state actor that develops this spectrum of sophisticated capabilities also, and I'm not going to be talking much about because one of the things that's very key here, because war is a dialectical process. When you're measuring the strengths of of your state in fighting an insurgency, you have to do a process of looking at your strengths and weaknesses and the strengths and weaknesses of the other side. And the LTTE was subject to some considerable weaknesses. First of all, it overestimated its strength, particularly what it was building, and underestimated the changes that were occurring in the Sri Lankan army. Military overconfidence can be, as I said, lethal. Secondly, its political wing was underdeveloped in contrast to its military wing. And any insurgent organization that suffers from this problem of what we call the two lungs not in consonant with one another will face problems in fighting a state. The Iraqi insurgents, for example, did not develop an effective political wing until around 2005, 2006, and even then its effectiveness was marred by the fact that there were about 80 different insurgent organizations that were at loggerheads with one another and not just with the US and the coalition. And one of the key lessons that the IRA of the 1920s talked about, rather than in the 1970s and 90s, was the consonance between an effective political wing, as enshrined or reflected in Sinn Féin, the political wing of the Irish struggle, and the IRA, the military wing. When you have a megalomaniacal leader who does not listen to his cadre or leadership that is around him, then almost invariably the political wing is either neutered or underdeveloped. And compare that with Guzman and the Sendero Luminoso in Peru. Another aspect that is really important to note here is that the lines between terrorism, insurgency, and quasi-conventional capabilities are increasingly blurred for the more sophisticated and developed non-state actors. For the contemporary, or in the coming decades of what I call the 21st century's growing problems of legitimacy, governance, and state failure, collapsing states around the world, not every single insurgent organization is going to be able to develop this capability. We will have what I call an era also of new wars, where insurgency also blurs into criminal enterprise. But you will also have these subgroup of pretty lethal non-state actors that will be able to create this capacity that I mentioned of terrorism, guerrilla war, and conventional war. And using them in consonance with one another, and at the same time, and also having the capacity, the flexibility to go up and down the chain, is what we call a force multiplier. And this is something that is going to be a problem for many states of many countries that are assembled here, unfortunately. Hybrid warfare has been with us for the past several decades, but it's growing more lethal, more sophisticated, and is going to be funded increasingly by both legal and illegal means. I also want to now touch on the issue of new media. There's a tendency of governments to want to control the media to show essentially to develop their own narrative. The problem is, in all the cases that I have studied over the past 2 or 3 years, governments are less flexible than non-state actors in making effective use of new media. This is one of the biggest problems that states are going to face, both before a conflict, during a conflict, and after a conflict. Because once the shooting war is over, the conflict is not over. The government must continue, the winning